Hi there. We just recorded an episode with Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt, which was focused on the time of year that we're in. We just began Sefer Bereshis, and we complete the Torah once a year. Where this Seder come from, the way we have the Parshiyos, we discussed at length that there was other minhagim, and it's very relevant to the dafim we just learned, because it was Minhag Eretz Yisrael where they finished the Torah once every 3.5 years, and that is discussed at length. And the sources for the way we do it, and the sources for the way it was done in other places, and we go throughout the generations, and obviously he mentions many svarim and sources for this topic, and we just learned this daf, Kuf Yud Aleph, of the Gemara discusses how terrible it is to go from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and perhaps tonight we'll put in Cherim, Shamte, and Shachiv, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt, it is a pleasure to be with you now after Sukkot. Some of us had the opportunity to meet you on your travels to the United States. Thank you for that. And we're here with a special episode. It's being dedicated in honor of the Daf Yomi Shir of Rabbi Shaul Greenwald. His shir is available on All Daf and other platforms. It's a shir which he really explains very well the questions of the Gemara, how the Gemara is answering the questions. He speaks out almost every Rashi that's relevant to the daf. Very many of the Tosfos are spoken out also, certainly the ones that are directly affecting Pshat, some of the basic questions, all done in a clear, concise way. People use it to prepare, people use it to review, and there are people who use it as their main Daf Yomi Shir. So go check that out on All Daf, and it is available on other platforms as well. So this shir is a unique shir because it's not directly related to anything Gemara, but it's related to the time of year that we're in. We just began the new parsha cycle, Parshas Bereshis, and there are some interesting things that you'll find in the Chumash, certain things that people wonder about. Who made the Parshiyos? Some of the small words that you find after Parshiyos at the end of Chumashim. These are some of the things that Rabbi Dr. Brodt will be addressing, and we're looking forward to this presentation like all others. Rabbi Dr., how are you today?
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem.
Okay, so you want to get right down to business. Very often you like to give an introduction to what this is all about. You could do that, but I think the first question that you'll be discussing today is who divided the Parshiyos?
Right, so first, to begin, the series of questions that was sent in by the sponsor is as follows. First he wants to know is, who divided up the Parshiyos in our Chumash? Sources, let's say, if there's Chazal, Ga'inim, Rishayim, that was one question he wanted to know, and were these also the divisions throughout the generations? Another thing he wanted to know was that at the end of every Chumash, there's a list of all different types of pieces of information, how many psukim there are, and stuff like that. And there's a word that says sudarav, and then it will tell you in each Chumash how many sudarim there are. So let's say if you look in Chumash Bereshis, it says sudarav is mem gimel. Now, what is mem gimel? How many parshas do you see in your Chumash Bereshis? Not 43. In this list, it also has the prakim, it has the psuchos estumos, but that's a different story. Now, then he also wanted to know, I guess, also which will hopefully come to some understanding through this discussion, is that he wants to understand there's a Rashi in Parshas Vayechi, and Mitzvah Shem, when we get up to, we'll quote what Rashi says and what the issues were and what might be the explanation. So those were the questions that the sponsor wanted, hopefully, to be somewhat dealt with in the course of this shir. Now, before anything, the truth is like this. There are multiple topics about Kriyas HaTorah, which we do a few times a week, and it's relating, as we just mentioned in the introduction. The reason why we're talking about this now is because we're right away in the beginning of Parshas Noach. People don't have an excuse yet not to fall out of Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum yet. Especially this year, you even had a few days to work on Bereshis. So when we talk about Kriyas HaTorah, there are multiple questions that people wonder about at some point in their lives. They hear different things. And this is one such topic. The questions that people ask, some people know more than others about him, is who made the prakim, who made the psukim, the divisions, the aliyahs. When do we have aliyahs? 7 aliyahs. Why do they stop in those specific places? Who made them? Um, Haftarah. Why do we have Haftarah? What Haftarah? Many times you'll see in shul there'll be a tumult about a particular Haftarah when you're supposed to lay in it. People might have come across in learning in different places that there's a matargaman. There was someone that used to say that was matargam the psukim and how that worked and when does that fall out of play? When did it start? And also, one other issue which also plays out is that when you learn Mishnayos and the Gemaras, you see that originally everyone who got an aliyah, they had to lane. Eventually it changes that there's about kaira or chazan, whatever it is. When does that happen? What's behind that? Now, all these are obviously questions that each one deserves a nice discussion. And this is a related topic also of curiosity in Kriyas HaTorah and in to understand our Parshiyos. When does this division happen? Now, that is the question.
I'm sure you've probably been to a shul. Certainly, it's happened like on a Monday and a Thursday where one siddur says to stop here and the other siddur says to stop there. You probably could tell us if it's at all in regular Parshiyos where there might be a conflict between different chumashim of where to divide up the aliyahs.
That's what I said. That is its own topic, which, yes, people have devoted a lot of time. Even currently, as we speak, I recently got an advertisement of a Chumash that supposedly has the correct places where one's supposed to stop. Another such Chumash, but it's a hot topic that everyone there's different. As I coined it in other places, there's junkies for different things, so there are junkies for these types of things also. Now, interesting is, I would think it's a simple story. Someone asked the question, who divided by Parshas? You look it up, maybe you Google it, you Wikipedia it, and you get your answer. And as we'll see today, that there's no real good, clear answers for this question, but there's an interesting discussion that of concepts and things that we've learned and heard about in our lives, some more than others, and hopefully we'll get some ideas about some of these questions. Now, the story for me, particularly in one aspect over here at least, begins with as follows. About 18 years ago, I was learning at night with a chavrusa, and an old chavrusa was learning the same base marriage, and he said his kid got homework from the Rabbi, and the Rabbi wanted to know what is the sudarim that I mentioned earlier that's found in the end of each Chumash, what is it referring to? So piqued my curiosity, I started looking around. I would say this is before Google became such a big thing that the first place you look is Rabbi Google. This person actually didn't have internet, only email. But so from then on, I always was curious about it and come across different things. And some of the information will come out in the discussion today. Now, I will also say one other point of introduction is, two other points of introduction. One is that a lot of people did not know. It bothered them and they did not have a good answer. I'll list them out in a second. And another thing is that I'm not attempting to explain every single aspect of this sugya as it relates and plays out. It happens to be as I was learning through and preparing it, I did not realize how endless it is. But as we know, Torah is just endless, and when you start looking into things, sometimes it just never ends. So whatever, there's a limited amount of time, and I cannot go into every prat of this topic.
Are you going to discuss simanim? That's something which you find simanim. You find the amount of psukim, and then there's a word that connected to the siman. Who wrote that? Where'd that come from?
That happens to be its own. It's his own shir, and svarim were written just on that particular thing, and that's a mamish, its own whole sugya, which is worthy of at least one shir also. So that is not today.
In other words, if somebody would have any interest in that shir, please reach out to either one of us. Perhaps that could be further on the horizon for All Torah Network.
Okay, now, so just to mention this thing, it's not like, this person, when he asked this question, there were big people, they didn't know. You see the Radal, for example, in his Hagdama to Psikta and Esther, I think in some Psikta and Esther or something, that he talks about it by Richos, and you see he's struggling to understand what it is. The Shaila Meshiv, in Askama that he gave to a Sefer Meir Eini Seifrim, you see also that he's struggling to try to understand it. He brings people that also didn't know. Then he says, Baruch Hashem, I had a dream. And through this dream, I now was figured out pshat, and then he goes with a whole pshat that he comes up with. Revolf Findenheim, who's very famous for being into diktuk and all these things, also at the end of his Pirish on Chumash, Bereshis, he also asks, one second. He also asks this, what's going on here? What are they referring to? And he tries to come up with some type of suggestion, but it's not really. Today we know that it's not really the right answer. Okay, that's all by way of introduction. Now let's get down to the topic, what we're talking about over here, what if there any of the sources that relate to give us some insight in this story. So we know that the concept of laning is way back. Moshe Rabbeinu. We find, just to list one source, Moshe was Masakin as a Yerushalmi in Megillah that they should lane Torah on Shabbos, Yom Tovim, Rosh Chodashim, B'chol Shalmayim. Like it says in Vayikra, Vayidaber Moshe es Me'odei Hashem al Bnei Yisrael. Okay, very well known source. Another source, it's in the same. It's another source it's brought in the same Yerushalmi, but it's also famous in the Gemara Baba Kama that Ezra had made a bunch of takanos. One of his takanos was that the Kayim b'Torah b'Sheni b'Chamishu b'Shabbos b'Mincha. These were amongst his 10 takanos or maybe more. Okay, so we see that there was way back. That means they were laning. Laning was a focal point of the a few times a week, especially Shabbos. They laned. But now, after that, we're pretty much in the dark. What do I mean we're in the dark? So we don't know so much from, let's say, in the Midbar, what happened? Every Shabbos, do we know anything going on? So we don't. Okay. I don't know. I don't even believe there's any Midrashim or something like that would shed light on this, to shed light about. Okay, fine. Moving on, when you learn Masechtas Megillah, there's a few blot that talks about various aspects of Kriyas Torah, intents. And over there, Reb Shimon ben Eliezer brings down also Ezra Tiklan Yisrael. Ezra was Masakin that about laning. Important piece of information. We want you to make sure that you kairin the klaloi shebataris kahanim kaidim atzeres before Shavuos. Usha Mishnah Torah kaidim Rosh Hashanah, and the klalos that are found in Chumash Devarim should be before Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara brings a reason. So we're seeing that there's giving a specific time when they want you to make sure to lane. Now, besides for that, is there anywhere else what you're supposed to lane, when you're supposed to lane? So you would think if you'd open up Mishnayos or at least Gemara, you would find a list, a straight up list every week, what I'm supposed to be laning. What do I do? And there is no such list in Chazal of everything. Now, but when one learns Gemara Megillah and early sources, you find certain things, especially for Yantif, there's the Kriyas Torah, what one's supposed to lane, and after, sometimes which Haftarah one's supposed to lane, but you don't find a thorough list. And not only that, if you look for where the Parshiyos itself, where the names of the Parshiyos, who said Parshas Vayeshev is called Parshas Vayeshev? Okay, and why is that? You will not find many of the Parshiyos even mentioned anywhere in Gemara, which is a strange thing. We're talking about something that was, as we said, it's taking place a few times a week.
Take one step back. The actual Chamisha Chumshay Torah, those names are found.
That is another very good question, which I'm not going into now, but we do find different names than what we have. Most notably, everyone, Chumash Bereshis, everyone knows in some sources it's called Sefer Yashar, and they often quote the Netziv in Heimek Davar, where he has a whole piece in his introduction to the Chumash, why it's called Sefer Yashar, and others know that Chumash Bamidbar is not called Bamidbar, it's called Pekudim, and there's other sources about the naming of the Chumashim, so that's also a valid question when that happens. Now, but so far, even what I'm trying to point out is it's something we did from the beginning, as far as the Midbar, and we don't have an exact. Only as time goes on do we start seeing the halachas that play out in the various sugyas that could be mostly found in the end of Megillah. There's another Gemara in Megillah, which is in Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. It says, "Taner Rabbanim, Makam shemafsikim b'Shabbos Shachris Sham Kayim b'Mincha." Where you left off on Shabbos in the morning, that's where you begin Mincha. B'Mincha Sham Kayim b'Sheni, that's where you begin on Monday. B'Sheni Sham Kayim b'Chamishi. B'Chamishi Sham Kayim l'Shabbos haba. Now, That's not what we do. But you see that it's doing something of the Ezra thing, because you see it's talking about Shabbos Mincha and Monday and Thursday. But we know we don't do that. This is the very Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Makom shem sikim b'Shabbos shachar sham karim b'mincha u'b'sheni v'chamishi l'Shabbos haba." Okay, Rabbi Mazer Lacha Makom shem sikim b'Shabbos shachar sham karim mincha u'b'sheni v'chamishi l'Shabbos haba. V'leim halach Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, and now what we see is that already, even in this time, at the Gemara, it wasn't so clear, and it was a machlekes. Where you're stopping, you're laning. But what happened? How many people were called up all the years? So we know 7 aliyahs, but where does that happen? And we know, of course, certain aliyahs, people have a whole thing that's more chashiv, which Rav is supposed to get it, and Hilchos Kain Levi Yisrael, all these halachos that the Gemara does talk about. But when does this start happening? Anyway, obviously, we are not going to be dealing with all these things now in L'Davar Seif. But yeah.
And we also know that many places give Haisafis, right? So there obviously isn't Likuva, and that's discussed in halacha.
Right. That's also, if you could, whatever, and where you're supposed to stop. Now, those are actually branch outs from something relating to this topic, but as I said, it's impossible to fit it into the time that we have allotted over here. Now,
meaning the numbers, that's clear in halacha, right? On different times, Yom Tovim, Shabbosis, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, that's clear. The question is where those divisions...
Right, Mishnayos and the Gemaras talk about, yes, exactly how many you're supposed to get. But how many psukim did they actually lane? That does, once you pass 3 psukim, let's say, so then you're Yaitzis. Let's say you lane 21 psukim, technically you're Yaitzis. When does it come that they're laning, let's say, Parshas Vayeshev, they lane that whole parsha? Was that always the case? Okay. So the answer is, it's not clear that every week for all of time that they're reading the whole parsha. Okay, very good. All of a sudden we have a Gemara in Megillah Daf Chaf Tes Amud Beis, and this Gemara, the point of this Gemara is very well known. It says that Bnei Marava Demaski L'Deraisa B'Tlas Shanim, that the people of Eretz Yisrael, they would finish the Torah once in 3 years, and as we know, it's assuming that the people of Bavel, they finished the Torah how many times? They finished it once. The cycle was once a year. So we're seeing over here that something's unique. And if that's the case, so there was at least two menhagim of how the Torah was laned. There's going to be huge differences. People always complain now, especially now. If you get stuck. Because America and Eretz Yisrael, for sometimes at a certain point in time, there could be a bunch of weeks that they're off on the Parshiyos, and you don't know which week to speak. And if you're traveling and how to make up and whatever, but in the olden days, back in the day, the Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, they had two different. They were completely off all the time. It wasn't just a few weeks. People get very nervous about it, which we'll see a little bit about it later on. Okay, Lamaisa, a very famous Rambam that's quoted over here. The Rambam says, Haminig hapashut b'chol Yisrael shemashlimin es haTorah b'shana achas. That today, I guess in the Rambam's time, you say he's not denying that there was about the minig of Eretz Yisrael, but it was that they finished the Torah once a year. He's talking about, the Rambam is here, he's saying haminig hapashut, which is, he's saying what was done and prevalent in his time. When do you start? Achar sukkos v'karim b'seder bereishis. And then he goes on, so he's telling you when you begin, when you finish. Okay. Now, we're going to get back to this. The Rambam says, what's going on? It's not such a common language to be found in the Rambam, ein minig pashut. Okay. Now, so far, these are some of the sources about laning, and so we're already seeing from this Gemara Megillah that it can't be that there was such a clear-cut division of the Parshiyos, because they're completely off. Okay, so now there's a beautiful sefer called Leches Machsheves from a very, very chashuv yid. He was Rosh Yeshiva at Eitz Chaim in London. Reb Nachman Shlomo Greenspan. He wrote a bunch of svarim. They were very hard to get for all the years. In recent years, less than 10 years ago, Mechon Yerushalayim did a beautiful edition, putting out all the stuff that they had of his into 2 volumes. Highly recommended sefer, lumdus, all different types of things can be found in the sefer. He has one of the things, he has a piece where he talks about the chalukas Parshiyos. When does it happen? So he brings down the Rambam that we mentioned, and then he says, but if you look in Rambam Halacha Beis, the Rambam brings down Ezra Tiken, which we also discussed based on the Gemara Megillah. Ezra Tiken, Lam the Yisrael Shi Kain Klolei Shebetayra Kahanim Kaidim Atzeres Shentayra Kaidim Rosh Hashanah. Okay, great. Then he says, so you see from here that the Chalukas of Parshiyos is before Ezra, based on the Gemara that we mentioned in Megillah. Okay, great. But it's clear, as we're pointing out from all this, he says what I just said also, that it wasn't a universal accepted Chalukah, because we see that the meaning of Bnei Eretz Yisrael was at this time to do it once every 3 years. Okay. He brings down all different things. He proves that Lamaisa, he brings down someone that wants to say that it was very few people that had this minig in Eretz, even the minig in Eretz Yisrael, the Gemara Megillah is talking about, was very few people, but he says he has a chachas that it's not true. It was common in Eretz Yisrael that this was the minig at the time. Okay, he proves it from Yerushalmi. Now, so but what comes out, bottom line, what's significant from all this is that there was no minute kavua, which is what we're similar to what I'm saying was the logical conclusion of this. Okay, he goes on and he talks a little bit about it. He has some suggestion based on what when it happened, and as I said already, announced it. I'm not going to say every person's knech because you're going to see the way I hope to say shortly. Many people say different kneches for this similar type of thing, and I'm not interested in boring the details, just to get to the main thrust of what's going on. Okay, so that's number one in the sugya. Okay, fine. So now we mentioned the Rambam, and the Rambam we said says ein minig pashut. So what does it mean ein minig pashut? So interestingly enough, we have in the past I've mentioned that one of the interesting sources that we have is that people used to travel, and people traveled already in the times of the Rishonim. We have travels. It's known as Masoyis of Rabbi Yamin of Toledo, I think it's called. And basically, he travels Europe in the years 1165 to 1173. This is Mamish in the Tkufa of the Rambam, around the times of the Rambam. He describes his trip, and he comes to Egypt. And he says, he talks about that there's a bunch of Yidden there, and he says there's two big shuls. Okay, great. And he says, in this passage, he says like this. One of the shuls, they're noyeg, like finishing the Torah, like the Anshe Bavel, which is what we do today, which is noyeg l'kreis b'chol shavua parsha k'may shayis misfard. And this Rabbi Yamin says that's the meaning that from where he's coming from. He's a guest in Egypt. But he says, but there's also a shul, Anshe Eretz Yisrael, and what do? They have a certain way how they lane, and they don't finish every year. The Chumash, they finish every 3 years. He says, and this shul, so he's talking about a shul, that would basically refer, as I said, we're talking about the years 1165, 1173. You could probably even figure out exactly which year he sees this. They're doing this minig of, that's mentioned already in the Gemara Megillah. Okay, that they're not finishing it every year. They're finishing it once every 3 years. He says, but they daven together, these two shuls, when? On Simchas Torah and Yom Matan Torah. I guess they didn't want to give up the Kiddush, because they only have a Kiddush once every 3 years. So they decided that L'chol Hapachas of the Kiddush will join forces. Okay, now, it's interesting is, sometimes, you think you have a source, this Masis Rabbi Yamin. Everyone knew about this from Masis Rabbi Yamin. This particular source, literally everyone quotes it. I'm saying even the Shalom Eshev in the middle of in Hilchos Talmud Torah, he's talking about something, and somebody gets into something, and he quotes, I saw this Master Binyamin, and he says this. And even right away, literally right after this thing came to print, we find in the Tikkun Yisachar, which we'll get to later on, he also quotes this Rabbi Yamin. Everyone quotes this, so this is like everyone's quoting that Gemara Megillah. Don't think it's just the Gemara Megillah or that it's a Zaytika thing. There was a shul, at least one shul in Egypt in the times of the Rambam that was doing it. Now that could explain a little bit possibly what's going on here when you look at the Rambam, because the Rambam is saying Ein Minig Pashut. He's referring to something. Turns out that there's more to the story, like always, and that is as follows: is Rabbi Avram ben Rambam. Now, in the past, I might have said that there's sometimes a gadol that he gets outshined by his father. He has a great father, and he could be great, and then he becomes forgotten. Rabbi Rambam has the bad luck of, in his time, he was unbelievable, and all of a sudden he's forgotten about. He only becomes revived different times. He was a prolific writer. He wrote a crazy amount. Only in recent years has he become famous. Different problems, things that he said, people say he can't be that he said, without getting into any of all that. But one of the svarim that he wrote was a sefer, which called in Hebrew Hamaspik Lev Hashem. Now, Hamaspik Lev Hashem, parts of it have even been translated in English. That's the Musar part. Less known is that there's a halacha part, and even of recent, they're constantly discovering more parts to this work in the Kairo Geniza. Now, what's significant is, in this sefer is on tefillah. It was printed in the early, I think it was in the early 90s by Bar Ilan University, and currently it was reprinted recently. We're not going to get into all the story about it because we want to get moving over here, but bottom line is that he talks about the shuls, that the two shuls, that there was two, that they had different minhagim, and he says they had other minhagim. And it sounds like they weren't happy. They had some other minhagim. It sounds like his father, the Rambam, tried to get them to stop it. Okay, and this is a passage in this Rav Rambam and Rambam, but we see again, he's also, this is getting us a little later because he's 1186. So there's still this shul, this community is being noyig like this nakuda of laning in a different thing. Okay, now, but it's more than that. It seems the shul we now discover from the Kairo Geniza documents about the shul, what was going on. Okay, this Ezra Fleischer deals with and others. Fine, we have to move on. Okay, now we fast forward, and it's really moving backwards. There was a chibur, and it's called. People have come across it, and they learn. And when you learn, it's called Sefer. We'll just call it Eitzer Chilufei Umenhagim Ben Bnei Eretz Yisrael Bnei Vavel. Okay, great. What is this? So this is a collection of numerous minhagim. I think it's like 50 pieces. Different minhagim, how Bnei Bavel was naig versus Bnei Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Now, when is this work? We now are able to establish this is early. They found pieces in the Kairo Geniza. So it's not like some Heintige guy was malakit learning based on his Yeda and Bavli Rishalmi pulled this together. This is early on work. Okay, a friend of mine discovered pieces in the Kairo Geniza. Was printed in, his name was Yosef Dubovik, and he printed in Yeshur and Chelik Lamed Daled. He printed some new pieces, a new version establishing that it is, even though we know that it's early work and people had it, but establishing that how early it is. Okay, now, how does it become famous? Why is it quoted by anyone, or is it ever quoted? The answer is yes. What happened is that when the Yamshel Shleima was printed, the person who was printing the Yamshel Shleima came across that the Yamshel Shleima, or Shleima Luria, had a copy of this. He thought it was the Yamshel Shleima that wrote this. But it turns out the Yamshel Shleima was not. It was just the Yamshel that had an early source that had this work. Anyway, so it's always quoted. Sometimes you'll see people don't know that it's not the Yamshel Shleima who wrote it. Okay. Rabbi Avraham Negra has a whole piece about this chibur in his Rav Palim, and others talk about it. Now, later on, I would say some point probably in the late 1800s, different gedolim were Isaac in the chibur. Rabbi Yaakov Shor wrote ha'aros about it. It was published in a journal, and there was a few editions that came out of this work. One edition in the 30s came out from Binyamin Levine. Another edition came out from Mordechai Margolis, and also an edition came out from Rabbi Ezra Altshuler, a great Litvish Gadol, with ha'aros u'daderes, also on this chibur. Okay. Now, what is so significant about this chibur? Because we find two passages that relate to our story. One is a cryptic sentence. He says that the Anshe Mizrach Kairim Parsha Shliach Tzibur v'ha'am Uvnei Eretz Yisrael Kairim ha'am Parsha v'shatz sudarim. Very cryptic sentence, which we hope to enlighten shortly. Then the next piece, the next passage in the Sefer Chilukim Mizrach U'Ma'ariv is that the Anshe Mizrach, what do? Oisin Simchas Torah b'chol shana, like us. B'nei Eretz Yisrael legimel shanim u'mechza. So here we see that they do gimel shanim u'mechza. Now, this whole story and the passage before, which we'll get to explaining hopefully soon, obviously has a lot to do with. And Simchas Torah, as we said, that was I'm claiming is that they didn't want to forego the Kiddush, but that's what this has to do with. Avram Yari talks about the early origins of Simchas Torah in his classic book on Simchas Torah. But the point is that you see over here, Simchas Torah, there was different. Obviously, we don't even know in Eretz Yisrael how they did it and when exactly did they do it. Okay. The shaila is in the Gemara it only says 3 years. Here it seems to say 3 years and a half. Is it exact or not? So it really does play out later on, but we're not going to get into in depth with all the different cheshbainis due to lack of time. Okay. Now, so these two passages need clarification, and we'll return to them momentarily. But now we go back to is to try to answer one of the questions we set out in the beginning, which is sudarim. What's sudarim? So I mentioned that a bunch of gedolim they taka had it shver. It turns out that in the 1840s there was a Jew, Gavriel Pollock, who wrote a letter to Shir. Shir is known as Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, Rav of Prague. Now, obviously, we have to ask a question. We're about to quote something from Shir, if we're allowed to quote something from Shir. So when I was just to mention, so recently, I believe there was a podcast by Rabbi Geber on Shir. I did not hear it yet, but he talks about Shir. So if one wants to get the history of Shir, but there's a lot to say about Shir. He had Arichas Yom and he wrote a lot. But when I was young, in 10th grade, so they began a Shir in Flatbush from Rav Herschel Schechter. And it was on Masechtas Kedushin. And I attended a few times. It was when I was home from yeshiva. And he said an interesting thing. He was talking about the Avnei Maluim, and he said, Hasidim don't use the Avnei Maluim. He said, why not? Because Ki Yadua, Shir published the Avnei Maluim. He even has some ha'aros there. So Shir was a maskil. So he's a maskil, so Hasidim are scared of touching the work of Avnei Maluim of the Tzais.
And I'm assuming you didn't mention this, but the audience probably knows that he was his son-in-law, correct?
That's what I'm about to say. Now, what it means is why was he involved with the printing? Because he was the son-in-law, correct, of the Ksais. So of course, some people say, he was either maybe married after he died. He didn't know this. He was good. He wasn't good. Anyway, I'm not here to discuss Shir right now. We could spend a lot of time on Shir, and I'm not doing that now. But at the end of the day, big people did quote Shir, no problem, especially in this story. But the Netziv quoted Shir openly, no problem. He read Shir stuff. And the Radal also, these two people were from from Yidden that were experts in Gainim, and they quote him, and they have nice titles about him. They in one place, I think the Netziv does say something about him, but he doesn't have a problem to quote him. Okay. Bottom line is, Shir comes and writes this tshuva to this fellow that asked him, what's these sudarim that I asked in the beginning that are found at the end of each Chumash? What is it talking about? What is it even referring to? Now, again, Shir over here, he has literally, I would say, 10 pages where he talks about with incredible bekiyas, incredible yeda, and based on the yeda that the information that we have today, we see that he was on target very much. From what he had to figure out what he did, is very impressive, and it holds up on some level, different aspects, what he said. And basically is that the Sudarim was the way, just like we have X amount of Parshiyos, so the Bnei Eretz Yisrael have to have a counting of their Parshiyos. So for them, the Sudarim is, when it says, let's say in Chumash Bereshis, let's say it's Mem Gimel, that is going according to those that finish the Chumash for once every 3 years. And so if you add up the five in each Chumash, what it adds up to, that adds up to the Kriyas HaTorah of the 3 year cycle, not the 1 year cycle. Okay, this is a suggestion, but obviously I'm saying it in a mamish, in a one sentence thing. He has 10 pages, and some of the things that he says in the passage of this Nakuda, I feel it's not right, but I can't go through every single prat that he says. Some of the things are very, very interesting, and maybe a different time. But yeah.
On the most basic level, what does it refer to? Prakim, numbers of prakim. What does it refer to?
Oh, what is it referring to? You mean? So just like when the let's say, how many parshas do we have in Chumash Bereshis? So we have 12. So if you do the way they linked, it will come out to be 40. It will come out to be 43, because they broke it into 3 or 3.5, depending on the exact calculations, and so it's basically their parshas were much smaller. If we finish the whole parsha, and they're doing it over 3 years, so it's much less in the parsha. But it's much more complicated than that. You're right, but that's the very, very watered down version to say what it is. Okay, but I'm going to elaborate in the course of what I'm going to say now. It will come out. We'll be able to understand a little better what it is, what he's getting at, and that's as follows. For example, there's a medrash in Esther. Lavadum u'shvachos ve'ein koina, lama ein koina, Rav Amar, al yidei shelo yeknatem divrei habris, she'ein bachem mi koina divrei chamishe sifrei Torah, minyan shel kana. When it basically says some type of cryptic sentence, when it's talking about the chamishe chumshe Torah, the minyan is 155. So what does Sefer Torah have to do with 155? It doesn't work with what we have. We have 54. There's 54 weeks, so there's either 52 parshas, 53 parshas, 54 parshas, whatever that is. But we definitely do not have 155 parshas. So what's shot in this medrash? Okay, so there's a sefer on Megillas Esther, on all of medrash actually, called Hatirosh, and it's written by the Marchesh's father. It's a beautiful chibur. And over there he brings down different people are struggling to explain what's the Pshat in the Medrash. He says he wants to make a correction, and it should say Sidrei Chamishe Sifrei Torah. That adds up to 155. Mean to say, it says Mi kind of Divrei Chamishe Sifrei Torah. It should not say that. It should say Sidrei Chamishe Sifrei Torah. What's he talking about? So he says he has Ashara, and he brings you a bunch of different chazals and different people that there's something called sudarim. And if you look in the Gemara Megillah that we mentioned all the way in the beginning, Daf Chaf Tes, which talks about the minig of laning the Sefer Torah that we have not finishing it not once a year, but laning it and finishing it once every 3 years. So it will come out, it's 154. There's 154 parts, assuming that there's going to be a leap year also somewhere in the mix. And he says that there's other midrashim, and you find a bunch of times that it says sidra, and that's what sidra means. That's what he says as says this is a possibility. Then he says, interestingly enough, I was in Vilna, and I went to my son, and he tells me, my son the Marcheshes tells me, also one of the great gedolim of pre-war Europe, says that whatever you just said to explain this medrash, Matzasi b'shem hagoyin harav shir, v'samachti l'das ki kavanti l'dvarv, and that's what it means. So what we're basically saying is that there was, for some reason, even though that shul in Mitzrayim, we're not making a claim that shul in Mitzrayim, that the Rambam in the Rambam's time and Rav Rambam in Rambam's time and Rav Toledo saw it, that was widespread all over Europe and all over Egypt and all over everywhere, but it existed. For some reason, this remained in the list. Okay.
I'm probably jumping ahead, but as you say that word, Sidra, just popped into my head. Many people call the Sedra, right?
Correct.
Where'd that come from?
Correct. So it sounds like it does have to do with this. Has to do with this. Now, Lamaisa, there are other sources that seem to imply when they're talking about how many parshas there are in the Torah. So there's a Masechta in Yerushalmi Shabbos. There's a lashon somewhere that says something to the fact that there's Meya v'Shivim v'Chamesh Parshiyos. So that will be there's 175 Parshiyos. Similarly, there's a Masechta Seifrim that also says that there's 175 Parshiyos. So what's going on here? So already Shir points this out, and others based on the Torah of Shir, that it's referring to again that counting of of how many times they lay in the parsha throughout the 3 years. Now the problem is, and this is a very big problem, is that now we're saying one thing we're saying was 154, 155, and now I'm telling you 175. So Shir himself is not convinced that that's the pshat in the Yerushalmi, or that's pshat in the Masechta Seifrim. But already early Neisek Kalim of the Yerushalmi before Shir did chap some as. I mean, say Shir runs with this. He explains a lot of different things that I'm not going into. But already earlier than Shir, there was, for example, in 1710, there was a chibur called Shema Shloima, and in the introduction, there is a passage where the person, it's a drush sefer, but the person who published the sefer says this in his piece of Torah, in his introduction about the sefer, when he's referring to this Yerushalmi that I just quoted, that says it's 175 parshas in Torah. He brings you the Yamshel Shloima of the minig of laying 3.5 years, because that's what you'll gain more. Because he said is that if it's 155, 154, that's only going to work with 3 years. So you'll gain some more. But again, yeah, the mathematical, the exact numbers and the cheshbainis of this, I'm leaving out, especially because it gets much more complicated when shortly. But the point is, already in 1710, someone says it. There was a pirish, a pirish Masechta Seifrim from which is called the Nachlas Ariel in 1732. He brings it down in short. There's a Nachlas Yaakov in 1793. Also Masechta Seifrim, he also brings down this particular pirish about this topic. Okay. So Shir, what I'm saying is Shir, he just runs with it. Okay. And he explains many more things with it, and I feel bad because I'm saying it too watered down, but that's that's life. Okay. Now we go back to I quoted this chibur of but the point is, one of the points that needs to be reiterated over here is that we see that the Parshiyos, it's not, there was no, it's that as far, if you're going way back, so in the times before, there was a period of time that there was an establishment, and not just that one shul that was a fringe minig. There was Bnei Eretz Yisrael versus Bavel. There was two different things, so there wasn't able to be an exact division of the Parshiyos as the way we have it today. Okay. Just to fast forward very, very briefly. So back to this, the Chibur Chilukim Shebein Eretz Yisrael, Shebein Anshe Mizrach of Eretz Yisrael. So again, how do we? I told you there's a cryptic line, and the cryptic line says that Bnei Eretz Yisrael Kairin Ha'am Parsha V'Shatz Sudarim. What's going on? What does that mean? They lay in the Parsha, and then the Shatz is Sudarim. What does that even mean? Whereas when it's talking about the Bnei Bavel, it says Kairim Parsha Shliach Tzibur Va'am. They lay in the Parsha. What's going on? So the suggestion, and this is again subject to great debate, but based on this Torah that we're saying, it means like this: that even those that did do the minig, so Bnei Eretz Yisrael, and they did, they had this concept of sudarim, so suggests Mordechai Margolis and some others that L'maisa, they also did the people, the Hamoin Am, also lane Shnai Mikra Vechatargim, the regular parsha that's similar to the ones that was being linked in Bnei Bavel. That's a radical thing. So it comes out. So yeah, you want to know what they laned in shul? They laned in shul differently. They finished it once every 3 years. But it comes out like this. They should really be allowed to have a Simchas Torah. Why? Because they're being Messiah, at least Shnai Mikra Vechatargim, similar to the Bnei of Bavel. Anyway, this is a chap, and it's not true, most likely based on careful reading. Ezra Fleischer deals with it at great length. We're not going to go into it, but the point is where it's coming from is because of the lashon. Because Kairin Ha'am Parsha, that's our Parsha, and as you pointed out, Sdarav is this new thing, is the 155 or whatever the Nuschais is, and that's what it's referring to. It means Mamash Alam the Shishtikal Torah. You have to read it very carefully, but the problem is that this is it's not clear that it's a text that's very meshubish, and it's not clear at all that this is the pshat. Okay, whatever. I'm just throwing it out there based on to help us understand better this Einfall of Shir, how it could play out. But as I said, they're not willing to accept it today. Now Reuven Margolis also has a beautiful piece in his Sefer Hamikra V'Masaira, which is kedai to read. And just reading these 4 pages with all the footnotes, you'll understand now much better what he's referring to. He puts it down in his unbelievable koyach of putting it down in short, to the point. He brings up different things, very masudar. He quotes many of the sources that are out there about the topic. Of course, there are more, and he puts it down very carefully. So now comes out, what about Rashi on, if we go back to Rashi in Vayechi. So what does Rashi in Vayechi say? So this is also plays out over here. Rashi in Vayechi says, Lama parsha zeh stuma, fisha kivan shenifti Yaakov Avinu nistamu einayim v'libim shel Yisrael mitzvos hashibud shetzchilu l'shavdam. So right away, the Mizrahi asks, stuma, what's going on here? Stuma, psucha, these are well known in Hilchos Sefer Torah. There's ways how it's supposed to be written, how much space is supposed to be between different parshas, and even in the particular parshas. You open it up. There's no. He says, then he also asks another question. You should start asking it earlier on. Why are you waking up to Parshas Vayechi? So then he says a fascinating thing. There's no revach. Ezra loy tikin tchilas haparsha zeis min Vayechi Yaakov elamnei shay mekubel etzloi sharoy liyosham piska el shashem gazer shloyasa oisay neizeh shola siba v'amru lama parsha zeh stuma. You say it really was supposed to be a different place, and it wasn't. Interestingly enough, the Mizrahi didn't have this, but the Rashbam says really the parsha of Vayechi was supposed to begin a pasuk earlier. That makes sense. That's the connection. But it didn't want to, because why? Says the Rashbam, fascinating thing, because it wanted to be Messiah with something, because it wanted to basically to be Messiah and Davar Taif, something that we find people like to make fun of. A Hasidic Shazach here, we see the Rashbam says this. Now, the Rashbam was only printed in the late 1700s, so it wasn't, but here he's saying, and he's explaining it over here. But now, says Reuven Margolis, without using this Rashbam or the Mizrahi or quoting them, if you understand the concept of sudarim, it's very possible that that's what it's referring to. It's not the sudarim; it's the sudarim of, I'm just for lack of a better word, the sudarim of the Bnei Eretz Yisrael. And those sudarim, we said, they had a different way how they ended up the parsha. In this particular case, I don't think it answers it up well, but that's just a suggestion. It's kedai to look at Reuven Margolis Bechlal in this subject. Okay, now. L'mashal, just to mention, I said that there's all different places that possibly could be rayas for it. Sometimes Shir does go for it, sometimes not. Other people bring them. L'mashal, there's a Rabbeinu Bechai, and in Rabbeinu Bechai he says Matayim v'shivim v'chamesh Parshiyos. He says this in Parshas Kairach. What's going on here? So Rabbi Yaakov Shur in his Pirish on Rabbeinu Bechai found in Mishnas Yaakov printed for a manuscript by Moshe a few years back. So he also talks about this, and he brings down this raid of this Masechta Seifrim, and he brings down the Yamsha Shleima and all this material about Sdarov. He knew this. He knew this raid of Shir. He doesn't quote his name, but he most likely knew it. And he says, what we call a parsha was sometimes called Seder Parshiyos, which you pointed out. You wanted to know about it. Okay. Lamaisa, he suggests that maybe there's a printing mistake over here, and that it really should not be Matayim v'Shivim v'Chamesh Parshiyos, but based on just like we found that the Yerushalmi, according to some, and the Masechta Seifrim have Kuf Ayin Hey, so that's what really Rabbeinu Bechai wants to say. Okay, these are just possibilities out there about it. Now, there was a traveler, and this is where we start moving. We're getting close to just a few more quick parts to get to the conclusions already, like this. First of all, the Torah of Shir really goes on to playing out and understanding in the Medrash. We find that there were different. When you open up your Medrash, a lot of times people are at loss what's going on over here. why is this piece of medrash relating to Parsha Shmois? Not Parsha Shmois, but that turns out it's possible that some of these midrashim are midrashe, what's called midrashe Eretz Yisrael. So the drushes would be according to that seder in the parshas. But I'm just saying the sentence, it requires a lot of beer, and it might not necessarily be true. Okay, now there was a traveler, a great chashav Talmud Chacham from Eretz Yisrael. He traveled to Europe to raise funds in the late 1800s, and he ends up writing up his travels. He ends up in Taman even. It's called Rabbi Yaakov Sapir was his name. The sefer has very nice askamas, and he saw a lot of interesting things. At the end, he publishes his travels, 2 volumes called Evan Sapir, and towards the end, he also writes up different discoveries and things he saw in his travels. So in the back of volume 2, he brings down an old chibur that he saw, and it says like this: Da, ki amininga pashut beroiva olam shemashlim nesatayr b'shana achas. From Chagas Sukkos, Parshas Bereshis, and you finish in Chagas Sukkos, b'Zayis HaBrachot. And therefore, the Torah was Shloisha v'Chamishim Parshas, 53 Parshas. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's not clear if it's 53, 54. This is Arichos also, which we're not going to go into. Just one person that talks about it of recent, my friend Yaakov Stahl put out a sefer of one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Chassid called Tzadei Chumash. There he has a few pages devoted to a collection of numerous Makairis, if it's Taka 53 Parshas. How do we get the counting of 53 Parshas? But here you see also a discussion about that. And then he says, then he brings down what's significant about it. That's the minig of Roy Va'il. Yesh Mekaimis, Shemishlimin Esatayr B'Shaloi Shanim, Umechalkin Esatayr L'Meya V'Chamishim V'Arba Parshas, 154. Now, this is the key word. V'hein hanikrain sudarim, Kitei Shiku B'Chol Shabbos Seder, V'Nimtza, comes out, Mashlim Esatayr B'Soif Shaloi Shanim, V'Arenim Mevar Minina Parshas B'Chol Chumash V'Chumash. And then he goes, this chibur does that, explains what is the amount of psukim in how they broke it down. Because we have it as, L'mashal, Chumash Bereshis, which in this chibur calls it Sefer Yasha, which we earlier mentioned other sources for that. We have Shnei Masar Parsha. They have it, a different number. So he breaks it down that Parshas Bereshis has Arba sudarim. What are they? And this chibur, this early chibur, this ancient chibur that this Rabbi Yaakov Sapir saw in his travels, talks about, has the breakdown of what it was. Okay, now 2 more points with this whole balagan, and that is as follows. All that I'm telling you, this was all known and written about, starting from when Shir wrote about it then, and it was published right away, and all different knetches, and I would say throughout the years it was discussed and people started to know about it. One reaction to this was a sefer. There was a sefer written from a dayan in Vilna. He publishes it in 1906. It's called Mesiris HaTorah V'Neviim. His name was Pesach, Finfer, and he was a rav in a few different places before he became a dayan in Vilna. And he puts out a sefer Mesiris HaTorah V'Neviim. What is the sefer HaTorah V'Neviim? In short, one of the things that he does is he wants to understand the prakim, the seder of the parshiyos, the vision, the sudarim, the psukim, the oisiyos, all different things, the history of the kapitlach. An amazing sefer. And now this sefer, he was in contact with Daderes, he has askamas from some other people, and it's incredible the amount of material he has in the sefer. And he talks about our discussion, he talks about it. At the end of the day, even though he saw mamish everything that was up to 1906, what was out there, including Shir and everything, and he saw various articles. He's quoting. There was a lot of articles that were building off it, and Lamaisa, he says it's nothing. It's a mistake. It was a mistake that it should have been put. It was a mistake. Someone wrote it a long time ago. Wasted time. Wasting. And you say after he saw everything and a lot of different evidence, and he knew about the Masechta Seifrims and the Yerushalmis and there's other midrashim and this place. He still. He literally has the list of all the material, and he just knocks it off. Okay, I don't know why this is so, but the Lamaisa, there's been many discoveries from the Kaira Gniza, which we're not going to go into, but we have already discussed the Kaira Gniza, and in this area, the Kaira Gniza also helped out, and there's been many articles of the different pieces that they found, where they are able to show that there definitely was, at one point, 2 minhagim. So that means is that even when the Gemara is writing this in Megillah, it's talking about, it was a minig. It wasn't like this far out minig in one place that they did it. So, what's significant for us is that at that time still there was no chalukah of the Parshiyos as we have it. You go to the store and you open up your Chumash, whatever Chumash you like to use. It just didn't have it. So now, what happened and all the nuances and all the sugyas that was brought up by the people earlier. So I'm just going to mention the names, not to. There's a Ezra Fleischer, who was a world expert on tefillah from Yid, who wrote hundreds of articles and books relating to tefillah from Gniza fragments. He spent a lot of time about this sugya, wrote about it a bunch of times. And there was there's a Yid who's still alive, an academic, Shlomo Noah, also wrote a beautiful, beautiful article. Somehow he comes up with a whole cheshbon. The whole time I keep on saying, and later on they find sources that Taka prove this of 154, 175, 167, 141 of the Seder Parshiyos. They find lists. They actually have lists of this. So they see it was done somewhere, not just in that shul of the Rambam, Rabbi Avram and the Rambam. So one of these people even connects that this whole minig, actually, it's strange. It comes out, if you think about it, it's a crazy balagan. They're laning. What's the Seder have? At least we're laning. We know. You have all the different things. Okay, so you'll say that you're an educated guy and you know that the hafsakas that we stop are wrong. But it's Chumash Bereshis, you lay in the parsha. By them, it's like it takes 4 weeks to Bereshis, and it's a challenge. What's happening over there? Somehow he shows that the numbers are exact, and it has to do with they started the same time as we do Sukkos, and they finished for Hakel. He has a myrdik chap how to get to Hakel, but there's intense cheshbainis and all the different makayros about it. This is in this article. Fleischer builds to explain his theories about it. There's a thing in history that one has to be very careful. Sometimes you could read an article from someone and it's mamish amazing if you read the top. But then you think and you say, okay, now I believe you. What you're saying sounds amazing. Now back it up with sources. And sometimes you just like, the sources don't exist. It could be he's reading it beautifully. Maybe he's a Navi, but it's very hard to say these things because we don't know, whatever. But he builds up with an intense understanding, which, if it's true, it's remarkable, of what tefillah was in the times of from the Beis Hamikdash, from before the Beis Hamikdash, what it meant. Kriyas HaTorah was originally first, then it became davening, and why that happened. Fascinating things, but you have to know which parts are true and which are not. Anyway, okay. So now, at this point, we're stuck. Do we have an answer to our question? So basically there was a fellow, Rabbi Weintraub, he prints a work he found from Gainim, in the Cairo Gniza. He dates it somewhere from 990 to 1040, and from this work, there taka is a chalukah already then of the Parshiyos HaTorah. Okay, so we have somewhere, but where was that work getting it from? Was that the source? Likely not. But we're showing that it's much later than one would imagine. Okay, that's one source about this. Another quick source is, we're getting closer to the end, is there's a chidah. It brings down a ksav of a chuvas. It's considered to be a chuvas a rush. We're not going to get into it, but it seems to be reliable. The chidah brings down as follows: chiluk hasidarim, the sidarim, the chiburim hu kidei shetala kriya kol Torah b'shanachas l'chein kol chacham be'iroi oy ba'artzoi chiber v'hifred hasidarim kefi haseder shera shehu anas vein haseder hu halacha kavua. There's no halacha kavua. Rak minig vein chayv l'shanis minig hanog b'rach l'kayim. Basically, there was no set minig. This is a tshuva, supposed to be a tshuva from the rush. And the Chidah brings this down. So this is not taking into account this Ga'in material that was found later on, but at least you see that there was no exact. Now, you'll say, does this play out? So I'll tell you just two interesting makayros relating to this also, and that is the Reform movement, and in our time, the Conservative movement. They have a field day with this. They don't want to listen to Kriyas HaTorah, the whole Kriyas HaTorah, so they go, we're B'nai Eretz Yisrael. And already in the Reform movement, when it began, this Elbeigen documents this out. They said, what do you need? They wanted to have a shorter Kriyas HaTorah. And the Conservative movement, Adayoyin, they have tshuvas written. We're doing that. We're preserving that minig, whatever. Okay. L'maisa, this also played out there's a known minig that when there's a chasen, so they lane in Parshas Chayesara, the end of the parsha, they lane Vavram Zakein. Shaila is when they lane it, is a part of the seven aliyahs, not. And this was a major controversy. At one point, there was, like everything else, controversy, chuvas written about it, and even some svarim written about it. And it seems some were lost or rare. Recently, someone printed a rare one of it. It's called Kuntris Al Inyan. He calls it Kuntris Al Inyan Shabbos Chasana. And Lamaisa, when you look, there's a lot of different things that are happening in this tshuva, but one of the things that comes up in this tshuva and a tshuva about this topic from tshuva's Bezdina Shal Shleima, also they bring in this Rambam and they bring in what the minig was and the Chalukas of Parshiyos. It plays out somehow in this story. Okay, now so bottom line, and this is just to be misakim to sum up what it is that we're coming out with over here in this story, so someone can have a takeaway, is like this. There is an excellent work, if someone wants to learn all about the Messiah and all types of areas. So it's from Yisrael Yabin, it's called HaMessiah LaMikra. So he talks about, in his entry, about Chalukah sudarim Parshiyos. So he says like this: the Torah, there's two chalukos of laning on Shabbos. One is Eretz Yisrael, they did it 3 years or 3.5 years, which you spoke about. It was either 154 or 167 chalukim, and it was called sudarim. It's mentioned in the Gemara, there's numerous sources, whereas in Bavel, they laned it with once a year finishing it. It was 53 parshas. Some have and it's called Parshiyos, as you pointed out, and some have 54. Earlier on, and this is the Chalukah today, and this is the bottom line, that basically the minig of Bavel won out for whatever reasons, which again you have to see the articles that talk about it. Why the Bnei Eretz Yisrael minig, which was first? That's another question to ask. Which was first? Did they maybe originally they laned the 3-year cycle? Then it became this. All these questions we're not dealing with, but we're at least attempting to give some type of answer to this question. We'll be messiahing with the last thing, which is that people, especially I mentioned, people always ask, why can't you just make the double parshas, make some type of conclusion, make some type of mass meeting, with the internet, have everyone come down and we'll have all of Klal Yisrael agree on something, so to speak. Is that even possible? Okay, so this is the conclusion. The conclusion is as follows. It was a very, very important sefer that relates to Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah. And that sefer is called, it goes by the name Iber Shanim Tikkun Yisachar, from a Rabbi Yisachar ben Susan. Okay. The sefer is originally published in 1564. Shaloi Bershus, someone stole it from him and publishes it, and he feels that it had mistakes. He himself goes ahead and publishes it in 1578. This is the go-to sefer that the Knesset Hagdolah Mashal uses extensively. Actually, and just throw it out there, this is the source for Tu B'Shvat. This is the earliest source for Tu B'Shvat. Okay, the Sefer, one of the reprints that came out of the Sefer a bunch of years back, has a beautiful article from Rabbi Tzal Landau, and there's manuscripts. I think even the manuscript of this Mechaber still exists. He's in Tzvat, the same time as the Beis Yosef. Anyway, he has a passage where he talks about Richus. I told you already, I mentioned that he knows about the Rabbi Yamin right when it came out already. He's talking about it. Anyway, he talks about what about tafsakas that you should, what are the tafsakas that you make in the Parshiyos. So he brings down the Masas Binyamin. He brings down, I said, the Rabbi Yamin, and he says like this. He said, it came out that in 1545, and again a few years later, there were people there, and it came out that the Bnei Eretz Yisrael, the visitors are hearing Parsha one way, and in Tzfat they're learning a different way, and they wanted to make Shalom, so they tried to talk about it, and to try to make it Shalom, and it wasn't successful. He says again, a few years later, they tried to again, and this was in one city to try to make Shalom, that there should be a universal laning, and and that way it wouldn't mess up anything. It just didn't work. Lamaisa, because we see, and so you see already then that they tried to I guess we want to have, for Gabayim, a lot of Gabayim love to be busy with this, especially in our recent kufas with all the calendars and all the different luachs. You always see there's certain people, the junkies of the calendar, they want to show off that they know which parsha it is, and they show off they know which haftarah it is, and mechuber, and why it should be mechuber. So we see that there was attempts already, to try to make shalom, and it didn't work. Why it is, is hard to know, but that's what it is. Lamaisa, when one learns Simon Tuf Chaf Zayin and Tuf Chaf Ches, you see that the Noisa Keil Mamish come out on talk over there, and over there is the halachas of when things are supposed to be mechuber. It needs an intent in order to understand it. You have to have an intense understanding of the calendar, which we refer you to the shiurim we gave on Rosh Hashanah, where we coined it the junkies of the calendar. I'll call upon him. That's the story. So we've attempted to answer the question. Obviously, the question is much better than the answer, and we don't have an exact pinpoint of when it happened, but this is some type of exploration of the story.
Okay. Thank you very much. For those still listening, I hope the people who dedicated are still listening, but really appreciate it. And one last thing, if you could just clarify for those, he said there's a takeaway. I think the takeaway was around 10 minutes ago, the closing takeaway or more. You said that we've been calling it the Minig Eretz Yisrael, but we see that they were doing that way in Chutz La'aretz also, this 3 year, whatever, this 3.5 year cycle.
Yeah, Egypt, right. And that is its own can of worms, and we're not going down that path of preserving a Minig Eretz Yisrael outside and how it still existed. And is there other, where there's a lot to talk about that in recent years, but we ain't going down that path.
Okay, now we have Parsha, we have Sedra. We actually call it Maver Sedra, right? That's what it's called, Maver Sedra.
Right.
Anyway, for all questions, comments, suggestions, please reach out to either myself and or Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt at eliezerbrot@gmail.com. My email address is shwaidem@ou.org, and we're looking forward to hearing from everybody, and we'll see you all soon.